To actually engage our audiences, it's very difficult. We punch well above our weight in terms of the quality of the content that we produce. Yeah, we're sort of in a David and Goliath type position.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Inside R&D, the podcast that gives you behind-the-scenes access to the innovations shaping the future of television and media. Now, you might be wondering, why does the BBC have an R&D department? Well, in this episode, I'm joined by Antonia Kerle, Chief Technology Advisor to the BBC, to help us explore why this department is vital to not only the survival of the BBC, but to ensure the BBC delivers value and continues to serve the public.
The biggest piece of advice I would give is not to be intimidated by things that you don't totally understand, but equally staying curious and being open to other possibilities.
Really, I want to get to the bottom of why the BBC has an R&D department. I suppose one of the reasons for that is because the media landscape is constantly changing, and quite often in ways that has quite negative impacts to broadcasters in some cases. So why is it so important for the BBC to keep up with the constant evolving technology within our industry?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think the BBC the reason why the BBC has had an R&D department has probably changed over the years. And it's probably gone from really, being in a place where we are creating those media technologies of the future, which isn't to say that we aren't still doing that. But, when everyone got their TV via broadcast or radio via broadcast, that was just, you needed to be able to think about how you were going to reach audiences at scale and most places didn't have the sort of necessary technology to allow them to do that. So the BBC sort of needed to invent a lot of stuff. And I think that's a big part of our legacy. I feel like now it's kind of shifted, still similar in the sense that we do a lot of making. We are a research and development. So we do create all kinds of innovations that help the BBC and the media industry to sort of do things more efficiently. But I think there are two other ways in which R&D really intervenes. And basically one is around being able to inform the organization to make sort of smart strategic choices given the technology landscape. 100 years ago was a much less complex environment that we were operating in than today. And there are so many more options to choose from and so many more decisions to be made from a strategic perspective as well as from a technology perspective. So having people in the room who really understand how technology works to allow the business to make decisions around how they want to do their content or the kinds of vendors they want to work with is super important. And then also, and this sort of sits a bit in my world in particular, there's real value in standards and policy engagement. So the kind of work that we do with, the UK government or, standards groups to help make sure that, the way that the media and tech and industry is moving is done for the benefit of everybody, right? Not just a few commercial entities. And there's really no other part of the business who can do that, but I think have the remit and the headspace, the sort of skills and the knowledge and the connections to be able to do that at any kind of scale. So yeah, I really see R&D's main value still being in making things, but being able to advise and also being able to influence that wider policy and standards ecosystem.
So what are some of the biggest challenges that the BBC are facing, and particularly the kind of challenges that R&D are helping the BBC work around?
So I think one of the biggest challenges for the BBC is around this war for attention. So not that long ago, people were able to, come together, 40 million of them, and watch Top of the Pops on the weekend, for example. And we really don't see similar scale events unless it's a sporting event or maybe, the coronation or something like that, where people are willing to engage. And now we all have so many more things that we can spend our time on, right? And so being able to try and cut through, all the options, whether it's gaming or YouTube or whatever else it might be, to actually engage our audiences, it's very difficult. And there are a lot of other competitors who have more money and a wider reach than we do. So I think that's one big challenge. And then one of the other challenges that we face also is just, cost pressures. And I sort of touched on that previously around, competitors with deeper pockets. The budget for the BBC is pennies compared to Netflix. But, we punch well above our weight in terms of the quality of the content that we produce. But it just means that, we are we're sort of in a David and Goliath type position. And that can be really hard for us to be able to sort of plan and innovate long term if we don't have the kind of funds available that some of these other organizations might. And I guess the final thing that I think we're trying to navigate is, we are accountable to the people. We're a public service organization. And as long as people maybe distrust or question the value of an entity like the BBC, then we're in a precarious position in the way that, say, a Netflix or a Prime or someone else, they're accountable to their shareholders, but it's a very different type of relationship. And so I think we're always rightly so needing to justify our value to our audiences and needing to find routes to them where they are in a kind of cash constrained environment. And that, that's a really difficult trifecta of problems to solve.
So this kind of shift in audience behaviour, how is that shift having an impact on the BBC's ability to continue to deliver its public service value?
Yeah, I think, one of the big challenges is feeling like our audiences know who we are and where we are, and being able to attribute the amazing content that we do produce back to us. So, and that can kind of come about in a couple of ways, really. So, we do have challenges engaging with young people, and one sort of example around how this might have looked different and maybe where we're seeing the changes today, parents would have potentially put on BBC programming for their children back in the day, and, Saturday morning cartoons or whatever, and kids would have engaged with the BBC that way. And so they would have grown up with it. And now, and I see this even like amongst my friends who are parents, right? They're much more likely to put on kind of a YouTube children's entertainer because, they have so many hours of content, and it's easy for them to get wherever they might be in the world. You don't have to sign in, you don't have to do this and that. And so it's those kinds of shifts, I think, in behavior that today make it difficult for us to make sure we're reaching young audiences in particular when they're small, and then continuing to stay with them as they age. I think the thing that also, and this is a future problem, is, we talk a lot about, discoverability in the kind of current world that we live in. But I think that is really going to become a much more difficult issue as we see AI kind of improve, because we already are noticing, for example, with Google's search generative experience, the summaries at the top of a Google search, the number of people who click on the websites that sit below that has gone down pretty substantially. That's had an impact on traffic. And so I think in a more sort of algorithmically driven media environment, the amount of choice people may even have to go to our content, to go to our website, to go visit iPlayer may actually be diminished, because, you're getting, summaries or even sort of generated experiences online that just mean you yourself aren't even going in there and typing in a website, right? It's being delivered to you. So I think in the long term, that is a problem that all publishers probably will need to contend with in terms of how do we reach our audiences when we're being intermediated by these types of AI interfaces.
So thinking about why it's so important for the BBC to be reactive to these changes, and in some cases be ahead of them. What is R&D's mission? How is it supporting the BBC in order to do this?
Yeah, so R&D is really focused on how we can enable the BBC and our audiences to thrive in an AI-driven, hyper-competitive future. And I think what that really means is, one, being able to anticipate some of these shifts, so being really plugged into what's going on in the industry and understanding the direction of travel. Two, having a real deep technical understanding of the opportunities and limitations with some of the different technologies that are available. So take AI, for example. It's really important to have a well-informed, well-researched AI team, because it allows for them to really interrogate claims that may be made by, large commercial entities about the value of their products and what they're able to deliver. So I think so that's another really key area. And it's also about, really creating and imagining these kinds of new types of audience experiences that might be able to, cut through some of that noise that I mentioned earlier. We've just done some work around live immersive at Radio 1's Big Weekend, and to sort of give anyone anywhere access to that experience. And it's amazing because some of the teams learned a lot from a technical perspective and how to do that kind of thing at scale. But equally, it really kind of it's a really interesting angle because, if you look at the price of ticket sales, price of tickets these days, or even if you're a young person, your ability to access these types of festivals is pretty limited. So it allows for us to do something that's new and different and cool, and also in a way that kind of serves that public service element of making it accessible to people who might not otherwise have been able to. So I think we are, I would say, across all the research that we do and across all the influence that we do, I think we're really making every effort we can to ensure that the BBC is prepared for the future in a way that, supports a more positive and hopeful future for society, for media, for trust, et cetera. And I think that's really important.
R&D has kind of been working behind the scenes to create a lot of these experiences for our audiences, and experiences that audiences might not necessarily know that the R&D department is behind. You hinted earlier that the R&D has been around for quite a long time. Are there any examples of kind of innovative technology in the past that audiences would have interacted with on a regular basis and they haven't realized that was a part of R&D work?
There are all kinds of ways that we're sort of helping the BBC that maybe aren't necessarily as obvious. So another great example, more recent, is some of the work we've been doing for our Spring Watch and Autumn Watch programs, where we developed an AI that would allow producers to be able to see whether or not there had been some activity on a particular camera feed. And so they could clip that out and talk about it on the show or on socials, which really saved loads of time from people who should have been spending that time, doing research into animal behavior, et cetera. So if you've watched either of those programs, then odds are you will have come across R&D in some way or another. But it's a lot of things like that these days it may not be as obvious, but we do touch a lot of things that people enjoy.
So the department is full of some really intelligent researchers, thinkers, and engineers. And you said earlier you're within the advisory team. So what kind of role does an advisory team play in and amongst this group of engineers and thinkers and researchers, as well as the wider BBC?
So I think we wear a couple of different hats. I think at the core, we are trying to monitor and assess trends in our wider technology and media environment. Now, loads of our engineers are doing that already. They are brilliant and deep experts in their field, but there are going to be some things that are happening out there that, rightly so, people aren't necessarily not aware of, and equally maybe don't aren't as connected into the implications. So like, for example, quantum computing, that's not something that on the surface will have a sort of significant impact on the media industry, but it's the kind of thing that we as a team could explore and try and understand what those risks and opportunities might mean for us. And maybe there's nothing that R&D does with that. And we just say, great, we know about this now. And nothing's going to happen until sort of 10 years from now. And so we don't really need to worry about it. I'm not saying that is our official position, but it's an example, right? And so I think that's one piece of it. Before we kick off a really big project, it's about having that sort of monitoring and analysis capability to be able to say, is there something here or isn't there? I think the other side of what we do is that we are storytellers. So we sort of take the thinking that is happening in R&D around some topics that might be really, really deeply technical and not immediately kind of easy to connect with if you don't have that background. And we use that thinking, again, to inform sort of the wider BBC's response to or position on key issues. So, for example, I've just come from a conference in Geneva with the EBU where we were looking into this question of EU sovereignty, EU tech sovereignty in particular, and EU cloud, all within the context of sort of resiliency, and particularly given some of the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing around us. So I think, and we have deep experts in R&D that understand that from a very, very kind of detailed technical perspective that would allow, and our work would be about working with them to take that point of view and position to elsewhere in the organization that might not have that sort of deeply technical understanding, and explain and tell that story around why it matters that the BBC would engage on that issue. And then the final piece, I think, is also being able to sort of work with colleagues across the business around what the BBC's strategy is and helping to use that to shape R&D's innovation portfolio. So we monitor externally, we take R&D's position into the business, and we also take the business's view of the direction they want to go back into R&D and think about how we can innovate around that.
Curious to learn more about the things we're discussing today? Head over to bbc.co.uk/RD to explore the full range of BBC R&D's work, including cutting-edge projects, groundbreaking research reports, and white papers on broadcasting and technology going back nearly a century. So, a lot of the innovation that happens in R&D is some quite far-reaching future stuff that will take a long time to develop. How does the department balance the innovation with the practical and instant impacts that our audiences can experience straight away?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think every R&D will have a real balanced portfolio around this. So there's going to be some work that is really pie in the sky or very long term. And that's right. We need to have that. And I think as long as you have kind of stakeholders that are willing to support that and understand the value, even if they're not going to immediately see the return, within 6 months or a year even, then I think that's great. And I think that's fine and how it should be. And then the other piece, of course, is making sure that you're working with your teams, whether it's in product or some of the content teams, to think still ahead, but maybe more sort of experimenting with the intention of that work being taken up by the business, maybe in a 2-year time horizon. And so there's a very clear need from whoever your kind of internal customer might be for that thing that you're working on, and the expectation that it would be able to be used in a short-ish period of time. So you just, as I said, you want that balanced portfolio across all of those domains. And certainly certain parts of the business will move much faster than others. And I suppose the final piece in all of this is that the BBC itself is a fairly sort of slow-moving organization. So, innovation can take a while, and, even just BAU can kind of take a while, and being able to integrate those things, it doesn't happen overnight regardless. So no matter what your portfolio looks like, there's always a bit of a journey going from innovation into, productionization.
If we explore that just a little bit more, how does R&D implement that kind of collaboration between the other teams within the BBC?
So I think the truth is it's difficult. It's difficult to take innovation from R&D and see it reflected in our digital products, for example, because obviously other parts of the business all have the things that they're trying to do and some very immediate term goals that they need to hit. And so they're not necessarily as much in a position to just pick things off the shelf and implement them. So I think we have sort of had varying degrees of success around that over the years. I think what I've observed is a couple of things. One, it's really about having that kind of champion on the business side who really, really wants and is going to push for innovation and understands that innovation isn't always about doing things perfectly, because the whole point of experimentation is that sometimes things are going to go wrong, and we have to be able to kind of be open to that and accepting of that, but that they sort of believe in that long-term, vision of where that kind of experimentation can lead. So I think that, a really strong advocate who understands what innovation is really matters. Definitely kind of bringing people along from the journey from the very beginning. So in advisory's role is to kind of try and seed that very, very, very first seed when we are having these strategic conversations. So before any roadmap is written out, before any code is written, before any of that happens, from our point of view, we want to be working with our colleagues across the organization to think about how, technology and innovation could support the BBC's mission and strategy from day one. So that way, when it comes to a place where we need to be able to take actually something that we have built and made, we already know is coming way back from those first conversations right at the beginning. So that's kind of the way I think that was always the way that, the director of R&D, Jatna Thora, envisioned that advisory would work, is sort of having those interventions at the very sort of strategic level so that everything else can kind of flow from there.
So what kind of advice would you give to both your BBC colleagues as well as any kind of other partners that other media organizations that you've worked with? What kind of advice would you give to ensure that collaboration can take place and everybody can stay ahead of the new emerging tech?
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is not to be intimidated by things that you don't totally understand. And the reason I say that is because I think oftentimes when it comes to conversations about technology, people can really shut down because they start getting into discussions about, Python and, SMPTE standards and all of this kind of thing that people, these words that get flung out that can, if you don't know what they mean, can feel really, really alienating. And, our colleagues that are in content or policy or elsewhere in the division in the BBC are absolutely brilliant. And I think totally understand where, the bigger picture. But I think can maybe shy away at times from those kinds of conversations if it feels like it's opaque or too technical. And so part of that is on our side to be able to make it easier for people to connect in with what we're doing and why it matters. But equally, like staying curious and being open to other possibilities, and asking questions about, what does it really mean when someone is saying, this is going to offer sort of productivity gains of 110% or whatever it might be, asking those questions, asking the technical people in your orbit, what's really going on, I think just means that, I think we'll create a much sort of stronger and more robust dialogue between different parts of the organization that really do need to be talking to each other today. Whereas before it might have been okay for, them to be operating fairly separately, but we can't imagine new kinds of content if we're not thinking about technology and everything that drives that. And equally, we can't just be thinking about technology with no sense of actually how might people use this and what is it going to mean for them. So they really need to be talking more. And I think sort of leaving any kind of hesitancy or fear or insecurity aside, and asking questions where we need to ask them can allow for that richer dialogue.
So I've been rounding off my conversations with a pie in the sky question. So how do you see the role of the R&D department in the BBC evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think R&D will look like?
I think if we were going to go really pie in the sky, I think it would be pretty cool to sort of see R&D as maybe not just for the BBC, but for the whole kind of creative industries, maybe in the UK or in Europe or something like that, like a really, something that is for everybody. And also I'd really love, this just a personal thing, and you can probably tell from my accent, like I'd love to see new research, new labs, new thinking that pulls in ideas from all over the world, right? That is looking at innovations from the global south, that's thinking about how we, deliver content to folks in India in a way that they're going to really love, that is, truly global in perspective and trying to tackle some of those global challenges. I think that would be really cool.
Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend some time with me and listen to Inside R&D. And as always, a huge thank you to everyone who has supported me in bringing this podcast to life. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe on your favourite platform so you never miss a new release. Please also like, rate, subscribe or follow, depending on where you prefer to listen, as it really helps the podcast out. I've been your host, Joseph Turner, and I'm looking forward to having you back next time. Until then, take care, be curious, and stay innovative.